Thank you very much, and thank you very much for braving the transport difficulties and for coming here. So Steve is really quite remarkable person to tell the story, because he has been a journalist and a storyteller, and you'll see when not if you buy this book, how adeptly he does the storytelling. And he has been in leadership positions in not one, not two, but three very important human rights organizations, two of which have a global remit, and one of which really is centered in telling stories and advocating from the perspective of victims themselves. And so he has a flair for storytelling, as you'll hear, but also the mind of an activist. This is a really important moment in history to be trying to dig into this topic, because as we will discover, the circumstances that gave rise to the international justice movement and moment, and the key architecture of the international justice machinery, though that moment, to put it mildly, does not subsist at the moment. We have gone back several steps, and therefore in some ways we're kind of hanging by our fingernails in efforts to achieve accountability. And so tonight we're going to do something which is honest and sober, but also hopeful, and we're going to point to, as we always try to do at the Conduit, at a direction forward. I mean, what we can do in this moment to shore up our most basic intuitions and instincts. Now, when you look through the table of contents, it is a cook's tour of kind of across the globe, and these are places where Steve has actually worked. And when I, thumb through the book, there's hardly a page where my life at ICTJ and as a human rights activist doesn't intersect with people here. So this is a kind of very wonderfully personal conversation as well. So Steve, people always ask why you wrote this book, and I'm going to ask you to do that, but I'm going to ask you to sort of wind your way to Slobodan Milošević in particular, because you tell that story so extraordinarily well.
Thank you so much. And echoing the thanks that we've had, it is extremely hard to get here. So thank you for those who did. It's great.
Yes.
And thank you for that introduction. So yeah, there's various different ways of why did I write the book. I mean, the first thing to say is I was thinking of writing this book literally 20 years ago, and got as far as doing a proposal and everything else. And I am so grateful that I never actually had the time to write the book on that occasion, because if I did, it would have been a truly, truly terrible book. Because at that time, a couple of years after the creation of the International Criminal Court, we thought, oh, we've got the court and everyone's going to live happily ever after. And it's been so much more complicated than that. And as you say, the place we're at now, I like the two phrases you had, that on the one hand, we're hanging on our fingernails, and on the other hand, finding reasons for hope, that I do still believe that there are significant reasons for that, which we'll come to. So I suppose this is a set of stories. Obviously, as you said, there's lots of different stories, but about stories of impossible things happening in many, many different ways. And my life has been peppered, I guess, with being very privileged to see some of those extraordinary impossible things happen. So in a way, I would start, as to some extent I do in the book as well, with even before we get to the subject of justice and what's been achieved. And in fact, we have an International Criminal Court, which is kind of completely, would have seemed astonishing for a while. I was so lucky that by chance I was living in Poland. I'd gone there to teach, to study Polish theatre and then teaching English, but was living in Poland in 1980 when this extraordinary movement happened. Solidarity, it's called a trade union, which it was, but basically an informal opposition movement at the time when Leonid Brezhnev, the guy who loved to send tanks in left, right and centre, when he was still in power. And I've still got some of the editorials from that time from British papers saying like, oh, these Poles are a bit crazy. They really shouldn't be doing this stuff, because they had gone way beyond the possibilities. Only 10 years earlier, there'd been tanks had gone into Prague. A year earlier, had gone into Afghanistan. But the Poles actually won. The tanks came in 15 months later, but again, they didn't win in the slightly longer term. And I think there's a lovely quote from the Polish-American author Czesław Miłosz, who basically said, we're always looking at the impossible things and putting them into the past, people who have done amazing things in the past. But like, everybody, can we wake up? Actually, these things are happening right now. There are very courageous people who are defying, his phrase was, the seemingly impossible things, I think is the phrase that he has, and making those actually happen. He wrote that in 1985, and only 4 years later, the Berlin Wall came down. And that was due to that extraordinary courage that I was very privileged to witness in Poland, a kind of defiance, like, you may think you won, but you haven't. So that set me up a bit. I was working as a journalist. I was then privileged enough to be East Europe editor at The Independent as the walls came tumbling down, saw change in Poland and East Germany and all of these different places. But I suppose the justice themes came, so that was about the possibility of change, but the justice themes came with my work when I was still East Europe editor. I had the good times in 1989, very quickly followed by witnessing the awful things that broke out in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia as it quickly became, which I had visited previously during the better times and was now back as Slobodan Milošević, the new leader, took power and launched a series of wars. So that Milošević story was indeed one of the weirdest evenings of my life, for sure. Slobodan Milošević was in London for a big London conference, which was supposed to, quote unquote, bring peace to Yugoslavia. The Croatia war had already happened the previous year, 1991, and was sort of over, in some ways over. And in Bosnia, the war had just begun just a few months earlier. So everybody wanted to get an interview with Milošević. I had managed to get vaguely close to some of his advisors who kept promising and dangling, didn't happen. Oh, maybe later, maybe tomorrow morning, maybe this. None of that happened. So eventually I thought, okay, I've never got that. I thought, well, there's nothing to lose except my dignity, which, not much of that. So I turned up to the fancy Knightsbridge Hotel and managed to kind of bluff my way through the various bits of security, saying, I have an appointment with the president, and turned up. And cut a long story short, after waiting for a while, was indeed seen by Milošević, who presses a whiskey on me. And I say, no. He says, why are you not having a whiskey? So I say, okay, I'll have your whiskey. And ask him then, might he ever find himself in front of a war crime? There's various other questions coming. But at a certain point in the conversation, the one I knew I wanted to get to, might he find himself in front of war crimes tribunal? And he was astonished. He thought the idea of creating a war crimes tribunal would be marvelous, because, of course, that would be for other people. And if any Serb were to commit crimes, of course, he must be punished. So when I came along and knew Mr. President, he was astonished because, no, I would be there for peace. I stand for peace. Just as various of the war criminals around the world today would give a very similar answer. Crucially, both he and others today, I do believe that he believed that he would never face justice. And equally, when I was asking the question, I thought, you will never face justice. It seemed complete fantasy. Even when they created that tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, that wasn't expected or expecting to get to the top guys. The politicians who created it didn't want that to happen. But the prosecutors who were there and a bunch of other people were very determined, and it got up. And eventually, as we all know, Slobodan Milošević, the guy who launched so many wars, died at the end of a trial, facing trial of crimes against humanity and genocide, and the other main Bosnian Serb leaders had the same. So for me, that always stuck with me. And around that time, I did a big portrait cover story for The Independent on Sunday magazine. I went to The Hague and saw the secret documents that were behind in the strong room. And only a couple of months after that, I saw Milošević fall. So that was another privilege of its own, to be amongst the crowds as that happened. But then to see, okay, they have delivered him. And that really stuck with me. And then I guess the next stage that came after that meeting with Milošević and seeing what came 9 years after our meeting, that there he was, he died behind bars before the verdict had come, but at least part of justice was there in the fact he was behind bars. I then joined Human Rights Watch in 2002. And this institution, which, to be honest, nobody really knew anything about except the human rights organizations, including your own, which were very obsessed by it, the International Criminal Court, which had been created in Rome in 1998, with a lot of dramas associated with that as well, but it was created. And in 2002, just as I was joining Human Rights Watch, it was there. So my professional life at both Human Rights Watch and Amnesty was all about what can we do with this court? Can it work? We had even then a US administration which was determined to kill the court at birth, to strangle it at birth. And they did various things to try and strangle it, just as the current president, who we're sure we will definitely come back to, is trying with even more vigor to do the same thing. So that narrative of change, I suppose, drove it. As I was just starting to think about, I started thinking about the book before the Ukraine war happened. And then when it happened, it's like, okay, what do I do with this? All these war crimes. And then when thinking about that, traveling to Ukraine a few times, I realized the story there was the amazing civil society energy that there was for making sure that justice could be achieved. And then while I was writing the book already came the October the 7th atrocities. So all of those things when I was writing folded together. In the room today is my wonderful editor, Samir Rahim, who believed in the book before those other things were happening. But for both of us, it changed the shape. That always it was about, can we do this? Yes, we must. Yes, we can, if you like. But the challenges to that grew significantly greater during the writing of the book.
Okay, so let's try now draw a thread or kind of look at the anatomy of these various justice moments, right? So you start by talking about the birth of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. We then have another international tribunal in Rwanda. We then have the birth of the ICC. And there was a particularly fertile moment in human history where inconsistently, hypocritically, for a set of very helpful contingent moments, these institutions all arose. And then they had a logic and an institutional momentum behind them, which has endured to today and is now being eroded or pushed back on very strongly by those people in power. But I think what we want to try and do for the purpose of this audience is begin to discern the clues. What was it that made those institutions possible? What was happening in the world? What were activists doing? What were the main sort of moral movements at the time that enabled us this very fertile 4 or 5 years, which was absolutely decisive? Because I want you to think a little bit on your feet on that one, because I think it will have clues to what we may want to be thinking about in the present. What we've gained, what we've lost, what we might regain.
Yeah, sure. So there's 100 different ways of answering that question. You can nudge me if I haven't gone the direction which is obvious to you, but I'm not thinking of. But one of the things about this book is that it's kind of, and I only realized this as I got quite far in, actually, almost had finished it, it's full of Don Quixote figures. And it's really interesting that very often either they describe themselves or they're described by others as Don Quixotes. That goes way back to Robert Jackson, the chief US prosecutor at Nuremberg, who says, like, this was a quixotic enterprise. This is his phrase, like, nobody believed we could do this. And for reasons we probably don't have time to go into, but Nuremberg is a fascinating story of how it happened against all of the odds and in quite surreal circumstances, including fancy dinners at Claridge's and the Savoy between the Russians and the Americans and etc., making these things happen. Very, very difficult to happen. Churchill didn't want any of it to happen. So they were these Don Quixote figures. And there was another one at that time, Ben Ferencz, who died literally just a couple of years ago when I visited Nuremberg, a square that had just been named after him. He is like a 27-year-old young US Army sergeant. He writes to his wife back in the Bronx and says, like, his girlfriend, then later, 70 years, his wife, says, like, this is all a useless idea. It's completely pointless, this justice business. I'm not going to have any part of it, he said, because it's not going anywhere at all. In fact, he later played an incredibly important role, not just at one of the Nuremberg trials, but in making this International Criminal Court happen, which seems so unthinkable. So by the time we got to 1989, we had this breaking down of walls in so many ways. So I would say that that was one of the reasons, is people kind of believed in the possibility of change. And it wasn't just Eastern Europe, of course. It was, as you know better than anybody else in this room, Nelson Mandela, South Africa. Chile had end of military rule. all around the world, there were incredible changes. And in that point, there was a kind of sweet spot that a couple of things I would single out, but honestly, you could go for so many different versions of this. But one whose story I tell, a young law student from Trinidad and Tobago who became obsessed with an American student who he got friendly with, that like, we can have Nuremberg, but why don't we have a permanent version of that? Remained obsessed, became a politician in Trinidad and Tobago, became its prime minister, became its president. In 1989, he was its president, and his friends were still obsessed with this same idea. And he put it onto the agenda of the UN General Assembly, A.N.R. Robinson, Ray Robinson. So that was kind of one bit. And then the power of civil society, which when many in the room may well have read Philip Sands's brilliant book, East-West Street, which focuses heavily on Raphael Lemkin, who came up with the genocide word, and Hersch Lauterpacht, who coined or brought back into circulation crimes against humanity. And I'm sorry, I've now lost what I was about to say about that.
The birth of the intellectual origins of it.
Sorry, that Lemkin was acting as a solo actor, if you like. He was this unbelievable, he called himself the Pest Lemkin as he went around knocking on the doors in ways that I absolutely recognise from my own work as UN Advocacy Director at Human Rights Watch, where you say, hi, do you have a moment? Can I just drop in? Oh, yeah. And, you have a good story, which is your kind of way in, and then you hope they'll listen to you, and then you really hope they'll print the story that you want them to. He did exactly that. I was part of a big organisation. He did it as a solo actor. Whereas by the time you get to the 90s, civil society organisations were hugely important. So there was one particular meeting, which was a bunch of dreamers, like 15 people in a room saying, how can we make it happen? From Amnesty, from Human Rights Watch, a bunch of others. And crucially, that was then global as well. So those were some of the things, but it was that kind of time. The 1990s was a time where, despite the darkness of the Yugoslav wars and the Rwanda genocide, there was a sense that together we can address this. And of course, we have lost so much of that in recent years.
Okay, so let's just, I think it is kind of worth reflecting just for a moment on the 90s, and then we'll catapult ourselves forward. But wave of democratization across Latin America, Africa, the end of the Cold War, the China rather docile and in its box, and if you didn't mention Tibet or torture or Tiananmen Square, they were kind of going to let you leave them to themselves, and they'll leave you alone. And an emergence of a set of actors in the US who were not wild about international justice, but were rhetorically more in favor of it than some of the kind of Cold War partisans. So you have this moment, you do the ICTY, you do the ICTR, you do the ICC, you build up some architecture of justice against a consensus that these atrocities can't occur. And so you had people acting against East Timor, right? Terrible atrocities in East Timor, and Indonesia, giant, important, systemically important country, gets hauled over the coals in relation to something that happened in this tiny little country on the bottom tip of nowhere that nobody's ever heard of, right? We're wildly nostalgic to think about the possibilities of that happening here. So these institutions get formed, and then we get 9/11, the war on terror, and then we get the emergence of this new era that we're in. And before we go into this new era that we're in, it's not just the trials that occur in a spotty way and in a really weird way. I think, ICTY, ICTR, and ICC, the number of people who actually go to jail as a result of these institutions per years in operation and dollars spent, the ratios are all wrong, right? These are deeply performative institutions which punch way above their weight.
Yeah.
So I guess the question is, there's one other thing that you talk about a lot in the book, and I want the audience to kind of think about it, is universal jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. Because that's a form of justice that's not specific to institutions, but which is way more powerful, much more difficult to put into a box, and is here to stay. And I want you to just talk a little bit about that, because it's an important part of the mix.
So all of these things were happening, as you say, at the same time, and 9/11 then opened up a kind of sense of lawlessness in many different ways, and also set up that template that this group over here have done terrible, terrible things. They flew planes into buildings in order to murder the maximum number of people in the shortest possible time. This was so criminal, doesn't begin to state it. And then the weird response to that, well, if they can break all the rules, then so can we. And that was made explicit, certainly in the US administration, but to some extent as well, the British government as well. So all of that was deeply troubling. But you're quite right that in parallel to these other big international institutions, and in a way you said it at the end, but I wouldn't give them a free pass because they are wildly expensive. But the people who've played leading roles in those institutions all say it's not just what we have here, it's about the signal that we can send. And all of them, so I spoke to two of the I spoke to the current chief prosecutor, actually now on leave, but anyway, the then chief prosecutor and Karim Khan and his predecessor, Fatou Bensouda from Gambia, while writing the book. And both of them said exactly the same thing, is we are a catalyst for other things to happen. And both were excited that now in Africa and Latin America and elsewhere, there's the low domestic courts happening. I hope that will happen in Syria, for example, also, which I visited in May. So all of those things are happening at the same time. So the international institutions are grotesquely expensive, but on the other hand, they are meant to have that symbolic quality. The question really is, can they maintain that symbolic quality, or are they in danger of crumbling? And universal jurisdiction kind of ticks along in the background, basically. And so I mentioned earlier that the book I was thinking of writing, that Ukraine war hadn't yet happened, let alone 7th of October, when I first started thinking. So at that point, I was fascinated by the fact that we were all saying, we were quite right to saying, you all in this room were certainly saying, and I was, and we all were, there's no justice on Syria. Like Syria, this war goes on and on and on, and nobody is held to account. But there was a key exception to that. There was a senior Assad torturer who was picked up. The same principle that Augusto Pinochet, the Chilean dictator, was picked up in London. Obviously, another historic moment. That was only a couple of months after the Rome meeting, which set up the International Criminal Court. So Pinochet had been arrested, and that had huge implications moving on. And in the meantime, for example, this Syrian torturer Anwar Raslan, he was arrested when he thought he was safe because I'm in Berlin, I'm fine. Little did he know that other people had recognized him. And he was then arrested by the German authorities, who, for understandable historical reasons, are way the most proactive on international justice. So Germans broadly, opinion polls show, did not like Nuremberg when it was happening. They thought the whole thing was a stitch-up. It was terrible. Now Germany embraces the history of Nuremberg, sees it as very important, and feels that international justice can play an important role. So Germany has been one of the most important. It's not only Germany. Argentina is interesting as well, because they also have learned so much from their history and have become super important on justice. So all of these things, which Britain has done bits of in rather unsatisfactory kind of way, but that is something which is definitely spreading in parallel to the big international institutions.
So the book is called Prosecuting the Powerful, and in some ways, all of our case studies are generally prosecuting the formerly powerful once they have been edged out of office or traveled in an unwise way or fallen out of favor or been dethroned. And then there's a whole body of work which I spent more than a decade of my life working on, which is how you set up, how you maximize the possibility of there being justice in the broadest possible sense, to try and make sure that when people who no longer have power can then successfully be brought to account. And so civil society organizations, truth commissions, deep documentation, robust victim movements, building strong institutions internationally and domestically, having impartial and professional prosecutors. There's a whole code of good forensic scientists. These are things that we need to build up domestically. We now, and we have these international institutions, and universal jurisdiction becomes very important because it becomes the thing that lets justice happen when the formerly powerful land up in the wrong countries and independent institutions hold them to account. So that's a very, thinking about the architecture of international justice not as one or two sets of courts in The Hague, but as the entire rule of law infrastructure of the entire planet is a very important way of thinking of them. Now we come to two cases which I want you to dwell on a little bit, which is Ukraine, which is Vladimir Putin, right? And Gaza, which is both the leadership of Hamas, but also Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli defense minister. Absent, take Hamas outside for a moment, but these are very powerful actors with an enormous amount of global influence. And I think the question becomes, what are the prospects of international justice being brought to bear, both now and in the future, and of modulating their behavior? And I think those three stools are something I'd like you to reflect on, because in some ways your book, that's a core reason, many reasons to read the book, but this is a core reason to read this book.
Yeah, thank you. So going back a bit, the indicting and prosecuting, you're quite right. There's a kind of a gap between those, and it's easier to write the piece of paper which says there's an arrest warrant than to actually get the handcuffs on. Handcuffs do happen, and crucially they happen sometimes surprising the people. So I described earlier how with Slobodan Milošević, he thought it's never going to happen, and then it did. And even after he'd been overthrown, he still couldn't quite believe they'd come knocking at his door and were taking him off. But a much more recent example was the former president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, who only a few months ago, he was trotting around Hong Kong boasting about the fact that, the ICC wants me, but catch me if you can. You're not going to catch me, basically. Returns to his own country, returns to Manila Airport, and there the handcuffs are slapped on him and he's transported to The Hague. So there's that sense that you never quite know what's come. But I think Milošević is also an interesting case of the direction of travel. So his indictment came when he was still president. And I visited Serbia a few months after that indictment was made public. There were huge protests against Milošević. This was a year before demonstrations finally forced him out. And in provincial Serbia, this woman, actually, there were many people who said to me, but there's one particular quote that came of like, he has made us the worst country. He needs to go. And there was the sense of like, we can only move forward as a country if this guy is just out of the picture, out of power, she meant, but also in a sense like, have what you like. And the Serb government later did this. With both Russia and Israel, I guess none of us have any idea what's going to come next. Does Putin kind of fall out of a window at some point? Is he there at the age of 90? I don't think so. Something bad will happen probably to him as well, but he may be in a dacha in Siberia. It's possible. And the magnificent British-Russian politician Vladimir Putin is interesting. I mean, he has said to the KGB guy who is kicking him out, deporting him from his jail cell, he said, this is the last time you'll see it. And Karamurza said, I'm a historian, you're not. I'm going to be back here, and it'll be sooner than you think. Now, Karamurza may well be wrong on that, although I do love the optimism. But that possibility is always dangling, making that connection between the indictment and the prosecution. And with Israel is so full of so many contradictions, obviously, that it's weird to have the idea of a democracy that may be committing genocide, but the fact is there is vibrant conversation. And in parallel to all the international stuff that's happening, their own Prime Minister Netanyahu is facing a corruption trial, which in bits and bobs is ongoing even as we speak. And so there is a society there. And as we all know, there were huge demonstrations before 7th of October to get rid of this guy. So again, where Israel will go after all of this horror begins to be over in some way, I don't know. But I met Israelis, including really brilliant Israelis when I was there, who said that is a moment for Israel to wake up and realize the craziness of the past. And we can only get peace and security if we understand that crimes is not the way forward, and therefore the accountability is absolutely needed. Michael Svard, a brilliant Israeli human rights lawyer, said, the ICC needs to stick to its values, because if it doesn't, then we're all lost, basically. And that's the way that Israel, if we want Israelis to be safe and secure in the future, you need to address all of that. So I think that gap between indictment and prosecution is is significant. And I'm not sure if this is the direction you're thinking, but for me, bringing it to the present day where we have a US president, I mean, clearly Netanyahu has been doing appalling things, not just the tens of thousands of dead in Gaza, God knows bad enough, and the things that he and his colleagues are saying, but directly also trying to destroy the court. There's been blackmail. A senior British lawyer has spoken of the death threats that he was facing. Dutch police told him he had to put bulletproof doors in his apartment in The Hague. Really kind of crazy stuff. He was ambushed. A previous prosecutor was ambushed by the head of Mossad in a hotel room in New York. I mean, really extraordinary stuff. So that's bad enough in the one corner. But Trump, who holds this kind of mesmeric power for European governments, thinks that he can literally just trample the court into the ground. He's imposed sanctions on a whole range of different sanctions, which have made the court's work much more difficult, not least because of bank issues, of course, that if you facilitate the work and all of the court's work is supported by the government who created it, which is European and other governments. So all of those things are happening. And then I think if one wants an emblematic example of how bad a place we've got to, but also I've got in mind your sense of what do we do next, it's that just a few days ago, his latest tranche of sanctions was against 3 Palestinian organizations, including brilliant ones who I met when I was in the West Bank last year. They do such brilliant work, including documenting. Trump imposed sanctions on these organizations for the crime of documenting the crimes of others. That's literally all that they have done. And that for me is like, okay, if you've had a president who's gone that crazy, that needs to be confronted. There may have been a word from some of the European governments, but I've missed it if I have. It's certainly not been like, whoa, you can't do that.
So there's a paradox in this, right? On the one hand, here's a tiny court, couple hundred, maybe 1,000 staff altogether, nestled in The Hague, which really stands for an idea, but it has no police force, no military, no sense of being able to actually use coercive force. And you have the President of the United States and a whole bunch of people that's attached to his administration directing an enormous amount of intellectual, political, and financial energy towards destroying this institution. So it's got to tell you that this idea is a powerful one for humanity, because if it wasn't powerful, then you wouldn't be acting against it with this degree of robustness. So the question then is, you could have very powerful ideas that get squashed and destroyed and demolished and never emerge, because remember, for earlier on, it emerged in a unique moment in human history that we may only get again in 80 years. So the question really becomes, if it is to exert the sort of influence that it may do, and it may, as you suggest, stigmatize the people it indicts such that they can no longer stand for office, can't travel, can't be held in polite company. When they get prosecuted for corruption, then they get edged out of office and get prosecuted for the bigger crimes later, Al Capone style. So there's a whole bunch of things that are reliant on these institutions staying and holding on. And you said earlier in the green room that Europe is essential to that. Yes. So tell us a little bit about what it would take to what's going to be required to make sure that the ICC outlasts Trump, but also remains a robust force in global affairs for decades to come.
Yeah. So first, you're obviously right, as we can all guess at. It was that very particular moment. And if the if the ICC stopped existing this year, next year, it's kind of almost impossible to imagine how you would put the pieces back together again, ever, frankly, because it was so special. And I feel, in a way, those in the room are better able to judge this than me, because I'm so much in my bubble of looking at this the whole time, and I have to remove myself from the bubble. But I feel that the threats to the court are not a main talking point in general political discussion. In other words, if you were asked to list, if most people were asked to list 10 things that Trump is doing which are like really dangerous for the world, it's very easy to find a list of those 10 things, I grant you. But my argument would be that amongst those things about what he's doing on Ukraine, with Putin, with Netanyahu, with economy, whole bunch of different things, which leaders quite rightly are getting kind of concerned about sometimes. Actually, the fact that he literally wants to tear up the idea of the rule of law, because that's fundamentally what it's about. It's the domestic rule of law, which we all know that obviously it makes life easier if there are laws and law courts that work. That's how each of us in this country can live in like, okay, things work. And anybody of which I think there are some in this room today who have lived in a country that does not have that, know how desperate you need it in order just to be able to live a more normal life. So Trump is fundamentally destroying that in the international rule of law. And I would love somehow that to be more of a talking point. And this is where I kind of go back into, NGO cliche speak, I suppose, really. But it is true as well that politicians listen to in a democracy, which we are, listen to their voters. And it's a question of them understanding this really matters. Because if, as anybody who's worked in an NGO knows, when there isn't the pressure, the politician, it will just go to the bottom of their pile, even if they're not against it as such. It's like too much hard work. And that's where we are with justice at the moment. I feel there's a fundamental failure to grasp the significance of this. And so given that having any argument with Trump is always a bit difficult, they're trying to minimize the number of arguments. And I think that for the future is unbelievably dangerous in ways they don't really understand. They've understood in the meantime that Trump hasn't, but European governments have, that placating Putin may appear to quote unquote give you peace, but of course it doesn't. It gives you way more insecurity down the road. I don't think that British politicians or German or French or others have understood that exactly the same thing is true of global security. ICC won't turn the world into a peaceful place overnight. ICC won't manage to put behind bars overnight all the big guys who've done the worst things. But the destruction of it sends an unbelievable signal that none of these rules actually matter, which of course is Trump's own view.
So in one way, like a sort of the short answer to that question is, in order for us to be able to prosecute the powerful, institutions capable of prosecuting the powerful have to survive.
Correct.
And then when the powerful lose their power, these institutions have the chance of holding them to account. Sort of sidebar note on the ICC for those of you who may not understand the kind of inverted jurisdiction of it, but it's worth pointing out the complementarity of its jurisdiction, which is it exerts influence by saying it will only assume jurisdiction if you're unwilling or unable to prosecute yourself, and you must prosecute yourself if you sign the Statute of Rome. So in some ways, the ICC's most powerful idea is that it's an institutional embodiment of universal jurisdiction. It exists in order to require countries to prosecute people, and if they don't, the ICC will. So that's a really underappreciated aspect of its work, and it sort of codifies all the stories you tell in your book become enabled and supported at a domestic level despite what's going on in the Hague.
What I called, I was going to use the phrase in response to one of your earlier questions, the nudge factor, as it were. It may not be doing that many things, but the nudge factor of like, unless you do stuff, the ICC will come in. And Netanyahu, of course, turns that on his head. He says, this is the biggest strategic, this is way before October the 7th, when the ICC started getting interested and was approved, if you like, to go ahead after a whole bunch of, it lasted for a decade. And he said, this is the biggest strategic threat that we've got. Well, you'd think if you're facing a strategic threat, you would take some evasive action. That's what you do to make that less likely, instead of which he just doubled down and doubled down. Whereas, of course, if there'd been investigations or prosecutions, then the ICC would have said, okay, we're out of here. That's nothing to do with us.
So this is a very important point, that if Benjamin Netanyahu says the ICC is the biggest strategic threat that he's facing, and then does things that are demonstrably, that, there are extraordinarily good lawyers who operate within the Israeli government, and does things which are just on the face of it clear violations of international law. This is a person not constrained or deterred by the court, but is threatened by the court. So I guess the question I want to ask, both in relation to Netanyahu, but also in relation to Putin, And it's a fanciful question to ask, and you could candidly answer that, Paul, there is no evidence. But is there any evidence, even at the margins, that the conduct of their conduct in war has in some ways been altered or constrained in any way by the presence of international justice institutions?
I mean, first thing to say is that's really hard. Any answer I will give will be vague, in the same way that if I were to ask, Justice Secretary else, does the fact that we've got a law forbidding murder, has that actually reduced the number of murders committed? Because there are so many murders that are committed every day. So those negatives are incredibly hard to prove. My answer, such as it is, would be a little bit picking up what you already said. If you want to judge whether this is seen as having importance, just look at the reaction. And Netanyahu's is the strongest, but is not the only one. His absolute undiluted fury, which was at the same time a kind of fear of what might happen, I think has to be the tribute. As with all the domestic system, you're not going to stop the crimes happening because you've got the mechanisms to punish it, but you do send that signal at which, for societies and for the world more generally, I think is important.
I mean, I think we were saying earlier, if Netanyahu were to arrive in London, he would have to be arrested.
He would. And Britain has actually hedged its bet on this in kind of interesting ways, but I think that's absolutely right. And therefore, of course, he wouldn't arrive because he and his people would make that same calculation.
And that's significant. That's wildly significant.
I mean, Putin obviously can't travel to Europe. His best mate, Trump, welcomes him to America as he laid out the red carpet for Netanyahu as well. So, both the North Korean leader and Trump have laid out red carpets for both Putin and Trump also for Netanyahu. But the Germans, for example, and the French, who both made very weird statements about how maybe he could come here, he would be absolutely nuts to do so, firstly. And second, what, for example, Chancellor Friedrich Merz in Germany, who said, I cannot imagine, it would be absurd, was his phrase, it would be absurd to imagine. It wouldn't depend on him. If he turned up at the airport, it's the law courts, and the German law courts these days work very well indeed, thank you very much. So they would be, the chancellor becomes irrelevant at that point, what he thinks or doesn't think, because the judicial system will say, we as a state are a signatory to the Rome Statute you already described, you have obligations, and therefore the court system would say he needs to be taken. South Africa actually had a case like this where they didn't want to arrest the Sudanese leader, al-Bashir, when he was there like a decade ago now, and the South African government then smuggled him out of the African Union summit from an airbase, and the South African law courts, as you will remember, were absolutely furious beyond fury that the government had behaved so lawlessly. So a Merz or a Starmer or a Macron are not going to go for that kind of thing. Oh, you're our friend, so we better do it. So basically, it becomes a hypothetical, which is then, as you say, really important. And Viktor Orban in Hungary will lay out a red carpet for, okay, what does that actually say? That's hardly a kind of something to wear as a badge of pride, frankly, nor actually with Trump. So I think that's symbolic quality, but it needs to be more than a symbolic quality. The fact that politicians are frightened enough that they say, I wouldn't dream of arresting him, that's troubling, even if actually I assume it would never come to the practice.
So I'm going to ask the last question, then I'm going to hand it over to the audience. I wonder if one of the conclusions we draw is that prosecutions, we always know that when you start prosecuting for people for mass atrocity, you're in trouble because the mass atrocity occurred in the first place. And secondly, the number of people that you prosecute in the face of mass atrocity is always a tiny, tiny fraction of the people who are responsible for the crimes. So courts are always in the business of ideas and symbolism, and they're not really in the business of sending people to jail. By that I mean people do go to jail for these crimes, but what they're really trying to do is convey an idea that certain forms of conduct are beyond the bounds of what humans should countenance. And we have a sense that we stand for ideas and the rule of law and dignity, and it's what separates us from a Kantian world where we just act in a barbaric might is right way with each other. And so in some ways, your book is really not about prosecuting people at all. Your title's a misnomer. The entire content of your book is about the idea of prosecuting people. And the idea of prosecuting people is not actually a rhetorical thing that we toss away and say, well, actually, that's all hypocritical. It's an essential part of what it is to be human, and it's an essential part of international relations. And that idea is actually the one that we should be fighting about, because that idea is in fact at risk, right? The world that we're in, the Trumpian, Putin-y, Xi world that we're in, is a world in which the idea of prosecuting people is what's being contested. And if we lose that, we're in all sorts of trouble.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, the first chief prosecutor of the ICC, Luis Moreno Ocampo, an Argentine, and Argentina played an incredibly important role as it moved, again, work that your former organization has done so much on moving from the bad times to confront it. And he was assistant prosecutor and a key, very, very early trial in Argentina. He was the first prosecutor. He said something really interesting. He said, this court, the ICC, will really be a success when it has no one to prosecute. Because you've already failed by the fact that you need to be doing it, either because, as you say, stuff happened, or because they weren't prosecuted at home. So it is about the idea, and it's kind of truly astonishing that we are in a place where the US president is not ashamed to be supporting the idea of impunity. He's done it explicitly, including with Americans who were charged with war crimes that they'd committed in Iraq and elsewhere.
With himself, of
course, as well. As even leave that one out as not international, but yes, exactly. With his own stuff, he's very keen on getting himself off in all sorts of ways, as we all know. But even if you look at the impunity for others, this is Trump Mark I, he was keen and did amnesty people who had been indicted or punished for war crimes as American soldiers. The American system had worked well enough. It isn't great, to be honest, nor is the British one great, but it had worked well enough. These people were done. And he said, no. And he kind of clapped them on the back and said, you're marvelous. And why don't you come to Mar-a-Lago, which some of them did. And it needed the US senior military to say, Mr. President, please don't do that. Because, how do I impose discipline if that's what you're going to do? And in a way, although I don't make a very big thing of it in the book, in a way that's an indirect answer to your question as well, of people who want things to work more or less rightly want there to be punish as well, hanging, because that's how you have less war crimes being committed. It's don't do that, mate, because you'll be up in the front of a tribunal, either in the UK or internationally, if not. So I think that it is very much the idea. And I genuinely find it puzzling. I know I'm always being naive on all sorts of things, but I genuinely find it puzzling that our political leaders, both in this country, we've got a lawyer who's the Prime Minister and an utterly brilliant Attorney General who wasn't in politics before he became made Attorney General by Starmer. So there's legal brains in the cabinet, and in France and Germany and Netherlands and so on as well. People understand these things. Incredible for me that existential moment, which is, to quote among many others, the president of the International Criminal Court, a senior Japanese judge, she said in December after Trump had been elected, she said, this is an existential moment. And she was absolutely right. She's been proved more and more right in the past 8 months. So I think that's something we need to wake up to. And there's a danger that we think that all of these things are somehow far away. We see our television screens and then, can't we just kind of get the war over? And that's the most important thing. Yes, getting conflict over, of course, matters. But as I discovered, I think I mentioned briefly earlier that I was in Syria earlier this year, and the passion for finding justice there was quite incredible, not just among the amazing civil society organizations I was talking to, but I went to a community meeting in a district, Daraya, which was, we were surrounded by rubble. Nothing has been rebuilt in the past decade, but this one cultural center was open. And all the local people had crammed in for this meeting to say, what does justice mean to us? And it was such a vibrant meeting. Some people saying, I can't bear the idea of punishment, I don't want that to happen. But above all, it was like, it needs to be addressed in some way and properly. And Trump thinks that nothing needs to be addressed. And that just needs to be confronted.
Questions?
Yeah. Thank you both very much. Here and Frank, you paid defense, but here in a personal capacity. I've worked in both ex-Yugoslavia, Bosnia, and in Ukraine, and frankly, for the European Commission, neither was the European Commission's minister. They come to people's guns. I have also worked in Sub-Saharan Africa and seen the enormous power behind the scenes of the Netanyahu, despite the fact, perhaps because of it, that Netanyahu is the head of the 14. So it really is quite considerable. My question is this, which something which I think international lawyers in general don't really take account of. How does the ICC and supportive countries address the issue of hostage taking? Because Russia, Iran, and North including by financial aid, and to a certain extent China, practice hostage taking. And that, I believe, is a huge restriction. When I put this to a UN lawyer, I noticed he was shaking. He didn't shaking. I saw the book in his face.
It's a really... You happen to go one by one, or do you want to take
two more?
Yeah, sure.
Cluster two, just two more. We can do that. Okay, please. Yeah.
But the question is going to ask, who is going to hold these people to account? Who is going to hold Putin and Trump, actually, and Lukashenko and so on? Because at the moment, it doesn't seem to be happening. So,
yeah. Why don't you take those two?
Yeah, sure. So I'm not sure if I understood your question rightly, but one element of hostage taking, I'm not sure this is what you meant or not, but is actually a huge theme, is hostage taking to block justice, which is actually not hostage in the conventional sense, but keeping people who can be traded, which is perhaps not what you meant, but that was what you meant. Okay, good. Okay. So as you may well be... Yeah, okay, good. So in that case, you may well be aware there have been some extraordinary cases. So on universal jurisdiction, which we talked about a bit, there was a very significant case that Sweden brought where there was a senior Iranian official who'd been responsible for terrible massacres in Iranian jail, very, very notorious in 35 years, in 1988, I think. And he, again, a bit the same thing, flies into Stockholm, everything's fine, and has the handcuffs slapped on him and didn't expect it, is prosecuted and sentenced and jailed. And everybody who is keen on seeing that says that sent a good signal. People in Iran who care about these things were like, at least a bit of justice for those terrible crimes. And then you have somebody arrested and charged in Iran, which is a Swedish citizen, dangled in front of the Swedes, who then do the swap. So that's the kind of thing. And of course, in a similar way, although it wasn't international justice, we saw Putin play exactly the same game. You had somebody who literally committed murder in broad daylight in a Berlin park, was close to Putin. He'd been like one of his bodyguards, I think, earlier. And was absolutely acting on behalf of the KGB, the FSB, when he killed this exile. And he gets a long jail sentence in Berlin. And then the German government, through gritted teeth, had to give that guy up as part of a large number of others who delivered, because of course people wanted Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter, quite rightly to be freed, and then a number of other Russian dissidents, including Vladimir Karamurza, who we talked about earlier slightly. So there was the good news of all those people being released, but at the same time, that person being delivered. So I absolutely don't have the answer to that, but I'm interested you raise that question, because it is a horrific way of being able to block change. Some of you may be watching this, the Netflix series which came out recently called Hostage, which has as a storyline the Prime Minister of Britain, whose husband, who's working for Médecins Sans Frontières, is taken hostage in French Guiana. And I think it's quite, obviously there's lots of fantasy within it, but it actually plays through those issues quite powerfully of like, of course I, as the person's husband and the mother of his daughter, we want that person back. But if actually I give in to this hostage taking at this point, then that has cascading implications moving forward. And so wearing a kind of slightly nerdy human rights hat is like, don't give in for hostage taking. But frankly, I completely understand why governments feel they're caught between a rock and a hard place. It's not easy. Who does it do it? I mean, yeah, I mean that's the unanswerable question in the sense, as I guess you know as well. As Paul already mentioned, the ICC has no police force, so you're relying on the people who are in that country giving that person up to justice at a certain point. So the Philippines, as described, did that just a few months ago. The Serb government did it with Milošević and with others. So both the arrest of Karadzic and Mladic, the Bosnian Serb leader and the Bosnian Serb military leader, happened years later. But again, because the Serb government was in a different space than it had been. And so it's a big hypothetical, but like at a certain point, there are many, I encourage everybody, this is my propaganda pitch that I always do whenever I'm doing a talk, is if you don't read Haaretz, the Israeli Daily, or Plus 972, please do, because the forthrightness of those Israeli or Israeli/Palestinian voices is so strong. And among other things, one of the drumbeats that you see there is, we need this guy to be delivered to justice in order that we can come through and be a better country. Now, I'm not saying that will happen in Israel, but I think it can. And again, I think we've discussed a bit of this before. In Russia, hypothetically, Belarus, you mentioned the Lithuanians have pressed for Belarus to be taken up by the ICC. Belarus is in a kind of little oasis of its own, really, at the moment. So I don't think we can guarantee that any of it will happen. But if Trump's allowed to get its way, we can guarantee that it won't happen. So I guess it's that.
I might just add one example, if I may, which is, it's in your book, actually. So I'm just, I think my favorite historical example, in many, of justice delayed but not denied is Argentina. So Argentina is a country where you have these terrible 30,000 people being thrown into the ocean and killed and tortured and disappeared with chains on their bodies. And then you have a brief spurt when the junta gets overthrown, where you have some trials, and then there's an attempt to kind of entrench impunity in law and in the constitution. And then over a 30-year period, Argentine civil society does a truth commission, trials, the most comprehensive reparation program, the most comprehensive program of reforming the military and taking them out of Secret Service and the way that the judiciary works. And over 3 decades, Argentina moved from a country of almost complete impunity to perhaps the most rich, multifaceted transitional justice experience in the world, including the largest number of prosecutions per capita of people responsible for mass atrocity virtually anywhere in the world. But it took 30 years of civil society, institution building, never forgetting, truth commissions, reparations, changing the way institutions work. And then you add on top of that what happened in Bangladesh with Sheikh Hasina, and, who thought that Muhammad Yunus would be president of Bangladesh, right? And so you have moments where countries turn on a dime for very unexpected historical reasons.
Syria,
there we go. But what you've got to do is you need all that prior work to be done. And the way to analyze the ICC in these efforts are, do they keep alive the idea? Do they keep alive the evidence? Do they keep alive the moral global consensus that whatever you've done, whether you Hamas or the Israelis or the Americans or the Russians, some things are crimes and you should be held accountable for them. And if you hold that line and you build the institutions and you have civil society and you create the evidence, the possibilities of justice are actually, I'm quite optimistic. It's just not going to happen tomorrow. But if we don't do anything to preserve the possibility, it won't happen tomorrow. And that's, I think, the historical lesson.
And all of the people who are working most on it all see it as a long-term venture. So one of the main Ukrainian people who's working for justice like day in, day out, she said, this is my job till the end of my life. And I don't think she really meant that metaphorically. That will stay. And I felt that the Syrians who I was talking to was the same thing. It was just the energy. But of course, all of them knew that they were very unlikely to get any prosecutions or convictions in the next 6 months or year. Basically, they're looking at a multi-year time frame. And Argentina is an interesting example. So it was called the punto final, the final full stop, like, okay, end of prosecutions. And the punto final was kind of actually the kickstart for the beginning of a whole different journey.
Asher is telling me that we're out of time, but maybe one final. Yeah, please.
Hi, thank you both. I'm Shireen Pakshif-Yaran. So I just wanted to ask, as you mentioned now, and Steve mentioned in the book, that the Western governments don't want to upset their allies. And as we've seen, they don't want to upset non-allies like Iran, China, and Russia. So do you think they're not really interested to bring any powerful government into justice, and they're happy with the status quo to happen, and then they're letting everybody to be part of any institute like UN, even they don't respect the most basic human rights. So nobody has got the guts or to their benefit to bring anybody to power, as Paul, you said, until they've really fallen and nobody cares about them. And that's the time that ICC and others to come to play. But the world's not interested.
I mean, I don't know if it's whether they're not interested in the idea as such, or it's picking and choosing, which is just as dangerous, I would argue. So I do think that Ukraine is really interesting in that sense, that Western governments, we already began to see a North-South division to some extent, even back in 2022, but that was way bigger after October 2023. But Western governments, European governments, and including the Biden government, were very supportive of the ICC getting involved on Ukraine. And under the Biden administration, and then they dropped off when Trump arrived, but something which the Ukrainians were pressing for, and which again started from Philip Sands, the British author of East-West Street, the idea of a crime of aggression tribunal, which for complicated reasons can't be prosecuted at the ICC in this context. That tribunal, it isn't actually created yet, but the European Union and Council of Europe and others together, basically the modalities are all there. They've agreed on the wording and everything else, and that tribunal will happen. So, and that's a leadership tribunal, basically, because it's about the crime of aggression, who is planning this. But the contrast clearly with what's happening with Netanyahu is kind of extraordinary. I guess it's the optimist in me, but I feel that European governments have to some extent woken up to the fact that there needs to be a response. Many of you may have heard an utterly brilliant speech by Tom Fletcher, former British ambassador and now the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, who gave a brilliant and passionate speech at the UN Security Council a few months ago, which basically said, you have all failed in this room and more broadly governments, and you will be remembered by the victims of this. It's a very unusual UN speech. International Committee of the Red Cross, the head of that, Mariana Spoljaric, also gave a similarly passionate thing, ways the ICRC never does. And there have been some small changes and responses to that. But I think they back away far too often. You're quite right. Yeah.
So, okay, one more.
You said that you felt optimistic. I feel really pessimistic. I feel really sad, angry. I feel it's not good enough to say, in the end, people want people to just, it's been 2 years. And nothing is stopped. I just don't feel. I feel gaslit. Is there a reason that you feel optimistic? Can you share that?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question, which is a really important one.
Good one to end on.
Yeah, it kind of is because it's the most reasonable question. I think there's almost not a review of my book that hasn't said this is kind of surprisingly optimistic. And I've talked to some of those who've written reviews and made comments and said, yeah, I don't actually disagree with you, but it is surprising. So to be absolutely clear, all of us in this room, I mean, the darkness is all engulfing. It's absolutely all engulfing. I think the case that I am making by looking at the extraordinary achievements of those in the past who have done things, and again, go back to my Miłosz quote, those who are doing things now, if we just say, oh my God, that's all a bit shit, I'm just going to go into a darkened room because it's too horrible, that has meant that the ultimate worst ending is absolutely guaranteed. And so, I mean, in the political sense, it's not to do with justice, but the fact of the energy of the protests which continue both in this country and in other European countries saying, not in our name. I mean, it may not be the phrase that's being used, but in a sense, that's the tone of those protests, including in Germany, which is traditionally tries really hard to be soft on Israel, but is also under pressure from German society, which says, like, the lesson of never again is never again in different contexts, not just that particular thing. So there are, of course, a million reasons to feel depressed by what we're seeing. I was interested to see some of our most leading journalists saying they've stopped watching news sometimes because it's so dark. And I guess that many of us may identify with that. But I think that if we say, I just need to hide under the blanket, that's actually allowed them to win. So I don't think either of us are saying that there's sunny uplands in front of us, because there's no sunny uplands in front of us immediately. But if we go, I can't stand it, because we have the Trump over there and various Trump lookalikes in our own country, again, not the subject of tonight, but clearly domestic politics has become poisoned in ways that seem kind of unthinkable only a few years ago, when both of the main parties shared a basic consensus on some issues of humanity, if you like. So there's so many reasons for darkness, but I feel passionately, I know that giving up at that point is not the thing to do. And we've seen that people manage to achieve things in circumstances where it seemed impossible they're going to achieve anything at all. So please don't think that I'm like, oh, everything is going to be, because that's not the case at all. But I do think determination is needed more now than at any time. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Archbishop Tutu used to say that on balance, human beings are capable of greater good than they are of evil, but on balance. And the difference between doing greater good and greater evil is acting. And we set up this place to allow us to be in community with each other, to be networked with each other, to be Ubuntu with each other, and to act. And in acting, we restore our humanity and we restore our optimism. And if we don't act, we get to feel like that. So, I think it's the acting and writing and leading an exemplary life, Steve Crawshaw. So we're extraordinarily grateful for you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. And